She opened the door, expecting the man she loved. Instead, she found two police officers asking if she knew who he really was. In that moment, everything she believed about the past 6 months shattered. The businessman from Turkey, the man who called her every night, who flew across Europe just to see her, who promised her a future, didn't exist. And what investigators had uncovered would reveal that every word, every gesture, every promise had been part of a plan that started long before he ever sent that first message. This is a true story involving manipulation, deception, and emotional abuse. What you're about to hear happened to a real person, and while we've changed names to protect privacy, every detail has been carefully researched. Viewer discretion is advised. Her name was Sarah, and at 42, she lived a quiet, predictable life in a small German town just outside Munich. She worked as an administrative assistant at a local engineering firm, the kind of job where you know everyone's coffee order and the office feels like a second home. Her apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with books she meant to read and plants she actually remembered to water. On weekends, she'd take long walks through the nearby forest or meet her sister for coffee, conversations that often circled back to the same question: why was she still single? It wasn't that Sarah didn't want companionship. She did, deeply. But after her divorce 7 years earlier, dating felt like learning a language she'd forgotten. She'd tried a few relationships, but they fizzled out before they ever really began. Friends suggested dating apps, but Sarah resisted. It felt impersonal, even desperate. Until one evening in March, when loneliness felt heavier than usual, she downloaded a popular international dating site. She told herself she was just looking, just curious. She didn't expect to find anything real. His profile appeared 3 days later. The name read Emre, 45 years old, living in Istanbul. His photos showed a well-dressed man with graying temples and a warm smile, standing in front of what looked like a corporate office building. His bio described him as a businessman, specializing in import-export, someone who traveled frequently for work and appreciated meaningful conversations over small talk. He messaged first with a simple question: what was the last book that made her think differently about life? It was thoughtful, unexpected, and Sarah found herself writing back immediately. Their conversations started slowly, cautiously, but within a week they were messaging every day. Emre seemed genuinely interested in everything about her, asking about her childhood, her dreams, the little things that made her happy. He shared stories about growing up in Turkey, his late wife who had passed from cancer, his struggles to find connection in a world that felt increasingly shallow. He sent voice messages in accented but fluent English, his tone always gentle, always reassuring. After 2 weeks, they moved to video calls. He apologized frequently for the poor connection, explaining that his internet in Istanbul was unreliable, so their calls were brief and often choppy. But even through the pixelated screen, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: seen, valued, chosen. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the end of April, Emre was talking about visiting Germany. He said he had business meetings in Frankfurt and could easily take a train to see her. Sarah's heart raced at the thought. Part of her worried it was too soon, too fast, but another part, the part that had been lonely for so long, wanted to believe this was real. Her sister expressed concern when Sarah mentioned it over coffee. Something about the situation felt off to her, the way he always had reasons for the bad video quality, the vague descriptions of his business. But Sarah brushed it off. People are cautious online, she reasoned. He's protecting his privacy just like anyone would. When Emre sent her a photo of his plane ticket for mid-May, Sarah felt a surge of validation. He was real. This was happening. He was flying to another country just to meet her. The day he arrived, Sarah spent hours getting ready, changing outfits 3 times before settling on something casual but flattering. They'd agreed to meet at a cafe near the train station, public and safe, the way you're supposed to do it. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking exactly like his photos. He stood when he saw her, smiled warmly, and greeted her with a gentle hug that felt neither too familiar nor too distant. Over the next 3 hours, they talked as if they'd known each other for years. He was charming, attentive, asking about her work, her family, the favorite places in Germany. He spoke about his business with just enough detail to sound legitimate, but not so much that it felt like bragging. When he paid for their coffee and pastries, he waved off her attempt to split the bill with a smile that made her feel cared for. They spent the entire weekend together. He stayed at a hotel nearby, never pressuring her, never pushing boundaries. They visited a local museum, walked through the old town, had dinner at a quiet restaurant where he insisted on ordering in German to impress her. By Sunday evening, when he had to return to Frankfurt for his supposed meetings, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Over the next 2 months, Emre visited 3 more times. Each trip felt like a deepening of their connection. He met her sister once, briefly, and while her sister remained polite, Sarah could sense her skepticism. But Sarah was falling, and people in love don't always listen to warnings. Emre started talking about the future. He mentioned how difficult it was to run his business from Turkey, how he was considering expanding into Europe, maybe even relocating. He never explicitly asked Sarah for help, but he'd occasionally mention visa complexities, how challenging it was for Turkish citizens to establish long-term residency in the EU. Sarah found herself researching the topic, wanting to understand his world, wanting to help. In July, he asked if he could stay with her during his next visit instead of a hotel. It would save money, he said, and it felt silly to be so close yet apart. Sarah agreed, ignoring the small voice in her head that said it was too soon. He moved in for what was supposed to be a 2-week visit. Those 2 weeks turned into a month. He was always on his phone, always in meetings, he said, always dealing with business back in Turkey. Sarah noticed he never video called his colleagues in front of her, and when she asked about his work, his answers grew increasingly vague. But he was kind to her, affectionate, and she convinced herself that not everyone is comfortable sharing every detail of their professional life. Then, in early August, Sarah's sister called and asked to meet urgently. When they sat down, her sister didn't waste time. She'd done some searching online, she admitted, feeling guilty but concerned. She couldn't find any legitimate business connected to Emre's name. No company registration, no professional profiles, nothing that confirmed his story. Sarah felt defensive immediately. Maybe he values privacy. Maybe his business isn't the kind that shows up in searches. Her sister pressed further. Had Sarah ever met any of his friends or family? Had she ever seen proof of his business dealings, his home in Istanbul, anything beyond his word? Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that she hadn't. Everything she knew about Emre came from him and him only. That night, she tried to bring it up casually, mentioning how her sister was curious about his work. Emre's expression shifted just for a second, a flash of something cold before the warmth returned. He seemed hurt that she would doubt him, asking if she didn't trust him after everything they'd shared.
He talked about how difficult it is to build something real when the world is so cynical, so quick to judge. Sarah apologized, feeling guilty for questioning him. But doubt, once planted, is hard to uproot. The next week, while Emre was out, Sarah did something she'd never thought she'd do. She looked through his phone while it charged in the kitchen. Her hands shook as she scrolled through messages in Turkish, running them through a translation app. What she found made her stomach drop. Messages to multiple women, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, all with similar tones, similar promises, similar affection. Photos he'd sent to her, he'd also sent to them. Phrases she thought were unique to their relationship appeared word for word in other conversations. There were also messages about money, about visa applications, about how to extend his stay in Europe. Sarah felt the room spin. She took photos of the messages with her own phone, her breath shallow, her mind racing. When Emre returned an hour later, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale. She asked him directly, "Who are the other women?" His expression didn't change immediately. He looked at her calmly, and then, as if a mask had slipped, his warmth disappeared. He didn't deny it. Instead, he became cold, calculating. He told her she was being paranoid, that she'd misunderstood, that those were old conversations, business contacts, nothing more. But his tone had changed. There was no affection left, only irritation that she'd discovered something she wasn't supposed to see. Sarah told him to leave. He refused, saying he had nowhere to go, that he'd given up everything to be with her. The argument escalated, and for the first time, Sarah felt afraid, not of violence, but of the stranger standing in her apartment, the man she'd thought she knew but clearly didn't. She locked herself in her bedroom and called her sister, who immediately told her to call the police. Sarah hesitated. What would she even say? That her boyfriend lied to her? That he was talking to other women? It felt humiliating, not criminal. But her sister insisted, and finally Sarah dialed. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. They spoke with both Sarah and Emre separately. When they ran his information through their system, something flagged immediately. The officers asked to speak with Sarah privately, and what they told her made her blood run cold. The man in her apartment wasn't just a liar. He had an active warrant in Turkey for fraud. He'd been flagged at the German border months ago, but had slipped through. His real name wasn't Emre, his business didn't exist, and according to Turkish authorities, he'd done this before, targeting women across Europe, gaining their trust, extracting what he could, legal help, money, housing, and moving on before anyone could piece it together. The case moved quickly. He was deported back to Turkey within 3 weeks to face charges there. Sarah never heard from him again. No apology, no explanation, just silence. The man who'd called her every night, who'd held her hand in the museum, who'd talked about a future together, vanished as if he'd never been real at all. And in a way, he hadn't been. Every moment, every word, every touch had been a performance, and Sarah had been the audience. The months after were harder than Sarah expected. It wasn't just the betrayal, though that was crushing. It was the loss of trust in her own judgment. How had she missed the signs? How had she let someone into her life so completely without truly knowing them? Her sister reminded her gently that this wasn't her fault, that predators like him are skilled at what they do, that manipulation works precisely because it's designed to bypass logic. But knowing that didn't make Sarah feel less foolish. She took time off work, saw a therapist who specialized in trauma and emotional abuse, and slowly began to rebuild a sense of self. Her therapist explained something that stayed with her. Loneliness is one of the most powerful vulnerabilities a person can have, and there are people who know how to exploit it with surgical precision. Sarah wanted connection, and he offered exactly that, tailored perfectly to what she needed. It wasn't weakness that made her fall for it. It was being human. A year later, Sarah lives in the same apartment, still works at the same firm. She doesn't date, not yet, though she's open to the idea someday. She's more cautious now, but she refuses to let what happened turn her bitter. Her sister visits more often, and they talk more openly now about loneliness, about vulnerability, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the people we let in. Sarah sometimes thinks about the other women, the ones she never met, but lived nearly identical versions of her story. She wonders if they're okay, if they've healed, if they've found a way to trust again. and she thinks about how many others might still be out there, sitting in their apartments, talking to someone who seems perfect, unaware that every word is a carefully constructed lie. Because that's the thing about predators like him. They don't look dangerous. They look exactly what you've been searching for. And sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in affection.